Margaret Ross Tolbert is a painter based in Gainesville, Florida. A continuing focus of her work is the springs of North Florida. Her solo and group exhibits include exhibits at Gallery Max in Stockholm, Sweden, the Lemieux Galleries in New Orleans, the Harn Museum of Art in Gainesville, the Daytona Museum of Arts and Sciences, the World Art Museum in Miami, the Polk Museum in Lakeland. Some of her permanent installations include works at the Gulf Coast Museum of Art, the Alachua County Courthouse, the Overton Metro Rail Station in Miami, the Weston Public Library in Broward County, and the Hyatt Regency in Istanbul, Turkey. She has received a Visual Arts Fellowship and an Artist Enhancement Grant from the state of Florida, and over the last 20 years she has executed a series of paintings, drawings, and lithographs from studios in the U.S., France, and Turkey. Her commissions include projects for a series of paintings with residencies in Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Oman. Recent exhibits have included dance performances and animations presenting the energy of the creative act of painting, of ethnic dance, and the exploration of the springs and the creative process. She studied painting at the University of Florida with Hiram Williams, where she received her Bachelor of Fine Arts degree and her Master's of Fine Arts degree, and she also had a minor in linguistics. Margaret recently published a unique, beautiful, and very enlightening book entitled Aqua Farias, which took a Florida Book Awards Gold Medal in the nonfiction category and a silver medal in the fine arts category. Welcome, Margaret.
Thank you, Mark. It's great to be here.
Thanks. Well, congratulations on your recent Florida Book Awards.
Thanks. This was very exciting.
Margaret, first of all, I just want to say I've been living with your book for the last couple of weeks, and it is really one of the most remarkable experiences for me. I've kind of begun looking at it as kind of a religious experience. It's such an amazing combination of art and science and knowledge and spiritual connection. But I want to start by, can you tell me what your first recollection of going to a spring is?
My first recollections were that I went to picnics at the springs and there was a spring in the background. That was pretty much it. I wasn't much of a swimmer. I was a distance runner, and I just didn't get it. I think my eureka moment was when I went in the water.
Uh-huh.
You know.
And when approximately was that?
I'm trying to remember when it was. It must have been in the 80s, and a high school friend came back and said, hey, let's rent some masks when we went to Jenny Springs. And that was just my road to Damascus moment. That was just like I went through the looking glass and went to that other world, and it was so unbelievable. You couldn't imagine what it was like just looking from the surface.
And which was the first spring that you painted?
I painted?
Yes.
The first one I painted was this little Blue Springs at Gilchrist Blue Springs. Mm-hmm. And it's not always there. So we were lucky. We went there, and it was somebody wanted some Florida landscapes for a show. It was at the Art Collector Gallery, and the director said, you have to have Florida landscapes. And I was very angry she said that. But I'm glad it made me go to the springs. Uh-huh. So it was a little siphon next to Blue Springs, and it's not even normally there. So only when the water's high. So I was lucky it happened to happen that way.
And that's the Blue Springs that many of us in this area, that's near the privately owned spring. Where
it's right 50 yards to the left of the main spring where everybody jumps off.
At the dock and the...
Yeah.
You know, I know this book was about 20 years in the making, I guess. You've had such an incredible journey of painting at the springs. And when did the idea to come up with Aquiferious begin to form, or how did you flash on that idea?
I didn't have a name, but I guess the first idea I had about it, well, I had a website in '98 about the springs, and I had a few of the same contributors, and then I was talking to Skiles one day, and he said, we should do something together. And so then I thought, I'll do a book with him. And that was very exciting. And I told him I had this great idea. And he wanted to talk about it, wanted to, how will we do this? And we were talking about it. And then at some point he said, I just don't have time. I'm just gone 300 days a year. So I soldiered on because I had an exhibit coming up, and deadlines work really well for me. They make something happen. So I had a 2-month exhibit in New Orleans, and I thought, I got to do this now. But I don't think I knew what this was when I began.
And for those who are not familiar with Wes Skiles, can you tell us who Wes was?
I guess Wes was the world's most famous and intrepid and brilliant cave divers. And he was from Jacksonville, but had a place right across from Jenny Springs, and that was his favorite place. And was an enthusiastic expert about the springs. He talked to politicians, to working groups, and he and his team have always been so great for any of us about the springs, the Karst Environmental. They've done those amazing films, Water's Journey films, and that have just made people get it about the springs. And Wes's photography is just outstanding. It really crosses over into, for me, like it's more like painting or theater. So that's why I was excited about working with him.
And Wes was lost to us in a diving accident recently.
Last summer, and when that happened, you know, it was such a shock. For me, it felt like all the little animals in the forest didn't have anybody to look after them. It just had that feeling, and I mean, he just had such energy, verve, and style, and it was so well known to so many. And he just finished the National Geographic cover story about the blue holes of the Bahamas, and in fact, Tom Morris is on the cover. So since Tom was his dive buddy for so many projects and his dear friend, I said, well, maybe you could write a tribute. So.
And there's a beautiful tribute in the book. What does the word Aquiferious mean?
I'm glad you asked that. I made it up.
Oh,
but
I looked in the dictionary. I couldn't find it.
As far as I know, unless they're typos, it's not used. It hasn't been used to this point. I wanted to do a book about the springs, but I also wanted it to seem to connect with the aquifer, and I wanted it, since the character of this is sort of like not your usual guidebook or not your usual coffee table art book, I wanted it to be a little bit different. Right. So I thought that sort of was about things pertaining to the aquifer. And then some of the contributors said, oh, they thought it meant aquifer IOUs. So, which is another good point. So,
well,
yeah.
And we do owe the aquifer.
Mm-hmm.
How did you choose the collection of springs that you highlight in the book?
Yeah, I could have chosen so many springs, but I do work frequently at these springs. I've worked frequently and consistently at these springs. And I worked at many other springs too, but I think I just decided 12 would be good, one spring per chapter. They started with the first spring where I painted. Mm-hmm. And then they ended up, each spring taught me something, or I learned something about how I felt sort of metaphysically, or about painting, different things I would do with art. So, you know, each one represents a different development and a different character. So, so I stopped at 12, but I could do another 40 springs. So.
Well, and it's almost like two books. I mean, you also happen to be just, I think, an excellent writer, and you're very, very capable when it comes to expressing the emotional connection that you have with these springs. But then it's also filled with amazing facts and figures and scientific information on so many different aspects of the springs. So, you know, I almost feel like I should list them. We've got Gilchrist Blue Springs, Jenny Springs, Fanning Springs, Silver Springs, Ichnetuckney Springs, Rainbow Springs, Manatee Springs, Peacock Springs, Juniper Springs, Volusia Blue Springs, Telford Springs, Little River Springs, Wakulla Springs. It's an amazing collection of springs.
Yeah, and they're each so different. I mean, how can a natural, I mean, you don't have mountains, I don't think they're as different as these springs.
Yeah.
And they're within this tiny radius. I mean, all these incredible, magnificent things that are very quirky. So they're right, you know, an hour or two's drive away. So.
I know when I first came to Florida, I moved from, I had lived in cities my whole life, and we moved to South Florida. But when I came up to go to college at FSU first and then later in Gainesville, I still remember the first spring I walked up to. It was a spring called Big Dismal outside of Tallahassee. Uh-huh. And actually it was about 40 feet down from the surface, and people used to mm-hmm. dive into it. But it was a very moving experience because I had never seen water that looked like that.
Yeah.
Now, You're quoted as saying you want the book to be about science and art, informing works of art, not just about science.
Yeah.
So when you were bringing together this amazing conglomeration of people, what was going on in your mind?
Yeah, I want it to be a new category, not just the art, but along with what informs it, like the science. And I want the reader to know what basically set my hair on fire when I was listening to these people. I just was so thrilled, and that, of course, goes into the work. And there was just so many intellectual jumps when I heard about the unlikely nature of the systems of the springs. So I want everyone to share in that as well. Besides seeing the art, I want to see the other side of the art come in the back door.
Had you looked into the science behind the springs before you first became infatuated with the springs?
No, I had no idea. I just thought, oh, these are great, these are springs. It sort of didn't occur to me like how they happened or that they were even connected to anything. Or the whole idea of the passages beneath our feet, that didn't occur to me. I just thought, oh, this is beautiful. This is it, I've arrived. This is paradise.
And Bill Belleville is one of the contributors to the book, and he has a article called Eocene. Is that the correct?
Yeah.
You know, I had a dictionary with me when I was reading your book. I learned a lot of new words. Eocene, memories fueled by a dream, which was kind of a historical perspective about the spring shed. And
It's beautiful, isn't it?
yeah,
he writes so beautifully.
How did you hook up with Bill?
Well, originally I had spoken with Jack Davis, who wrote the book about Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, and I said, I want to do this book with Wes, and so I want you to write with us. And to my surprise, he demurred and he said, well, I'm not the one. You need to talk to Bill Belleville. I was like, okay. And he said, you know, River of Lakes is the most amazing book. And Bill and I met at Juniper, and he had never been there, and he was just, the hallmark of these contributors. All of them were just like, okay, what do you need? When do you need it? I mean, they were so helpful about this. And Bill is just the Bartram of, I mean, it's like the most beautiful prose. I don't know how he writes like that. And such an accomplished explorer of Florida and the springs. And so I like how he contextualizes the springs, and he talks about everything from, it is like a time machine. You know, you find the mammoth jawbones, and you find the shark's teeth, and you find so many, like, sand dollars, sea biscuits from an ancient sea will be maybe in these springs caverns. So they're really like, time is a different place there.
And he goes into the spring shed kind of science.
Yes, he does. I like how he sort of fills in that part, and he was trying to do that for the book. Mm-hmm. The science of it and the history of the science and the potential future, and I think he does that in a very poetic way. And he believes so strongly in art bringing the message of these beautiful places to people where science cannot. So.
And Jim Stevenson, who is the Ichnetucknee Springs Working Group Coordinator, his contribution was cloudy but hopeful future. Yeah. So I guess he's talking a lot about just the impacts that some of the habits that humans have, what those things are doing to the springs.
Yes, he's like the great statesman of the springs, and he was head of the Springs Task Force for the state, and he's no longer head of the working group. But I owe Jim so much, because I would go to the Ichnetucknee Working Group in Lake City, and he would have this array of speakers that, you know, and I knew they were good speakers and performers, in that sense, presenters. So this was really where he gave me my diet of springs information. I later started to go into some other groups, but this was where I got it. So.
Howard Jelks, who is a fish biologist with the U.S. Geological Survey, I love that picture next to his writing that has just that kind of row of fish that are at the springs. And how did you? I'm just fascinated how you hooked up with all these people.
He was the very first one. You know, I was like, I mean, all this did happen like 20 years, but 5 months or something. So he was the very first one, and I heard Howard give a speech at Alachua Conservation Trust, and I knew he was a great speaker. So I wanted him to say something eloquent about the springs, and Howard had given me slides before, and I've been working on my presentation of 20 years of springs painting, and I'd given it to him and his group at USGS, and he had given me the slide of a blue nose shiner that was a fish that was special to Alexander Springs. And all those fish images he gave me to use. And I mean, it's so exciting, the strange creatures that inhabit the springs as well.
John Martin, I thought his writings were so interesting. He's a fish, he's a professor of geological sciences at UF, and he wrote an article called Spring Water Ages. And it had never occurred to me to think about how old is a drop of water. Can you fill us in a little bit on the subject of...
Time is so different in the springs, the way I see it. I mean, he's given talks at the Ichitechnee Working Group too, and he had also contributed to my website early on. But you know, so much of it is that you can date how long the water has been underground. That's sort of the age of the water by the presence of certain isotopes or certain chemical ingredients like freon, or they do a kind of carbon dating. So by a combination of these things, which I think is complicated, but he indicates how you do it in the article, you can say this spring has water that's 450 years old, a mixture of waters that average that age. And so some might be older and some are newer. And this spring has 30-year-old water, which means it went into the ground 30 years ago, and it's just coming out now. So it reflects the history of what we did in our society 30 years before or 400 years before. It's like a record of that, like a photograph of that.
And just that it can exist in this system of caves and tunnels and caverns, the journey that it goes through before it comes back up is
secret,
fascinating.
unknown journey. It was like we have no idea this is circulating beneath our feet for maybe decades or centuries. And then he pointed out something really interesting too, that the rock can contain water. That's another interesting, it has a porosity, so a lot of the water is contained in the pores in these rocks.
It's not just the huge caverns underground. Yeah. Speaking of huge caverns, you've got a class of collaborators that I noticed are identified as extreme cave divers. And I'm a scuba diver, and I've done a lot of diving, but it's always been in the ocean. The thought about entering a enclosed space does not appeal to me at all. However, when I looked at the pictures and when I've seen some of Wes Skiles and others' films, you realize, and you touch on it in the book about, you know, those major geological things that we think of, like the Grand Canyon and the mountains, but what exists underground is equally as spectacular. And one of the extreme cave divers was Tom Morris, who you mentioned earlier, and he did an article about the missing shrimp of Squirrel Chimney, which sounds like a children's detective story. Can you fill us in a little bit about that story?
Well, he was the last of the contributors of the first book, and he was going off to do the Bahamas story with Wes and those guys. So apparently at 2 a.m. he was like hammering out this story, and some of the other divers, he said, would say, no, don't write that, or don't write that. So it went through lots of changes. But he wanted to explain the connection he has as a child with the story of the shrimp, the 200-year-old shrimp, perhaps, of Squirrel Chimney. And then he found himself looking for that. Again, the next group of scientists, I don't know whether it was 20 or 30 years later, there he was going into the same place. And he was explaining it's easy to prove the existence of something, but more difficult to prove if they become extinct. Right. So they can't find this magical little shrimp that was, you know, all hair-like appendages, sensing the changes in the water and you know, floating in the dark there, because he's afraid, as he mentions in the article, that some fish called chub came in and maybe made a meal of them. But Tom was the one I would call up with all these questions like, so how can it be 200 years old? And I just thought my sister said, explain about the tannin in the water. Or when I went to Juniper, all the eelgrass gives off these little bubbles. It's amazing. And I said, why does this happen? You know, and he's like, well, it's the diatomaceous algae on the eelgrass. And then I'll have another question. So and he called himself a biologist. And I was like, I think you're more than a biologist, because I heard so many stories of like when he and Eric or he and Wes went places, and then a piece of the the cavern would fall down and pin somebody's legs, and they would get out. And Eric described Silver Springs as being like the consistency of a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. You know, it sounds kind of soft. It's like you can't depend on those spaces.
Yeah.
And then it was constantly changing and moving and falling and, you know, morphing.
I loved the explanation of the longevity of some of those creatures, just that the water is so cold and the oxygen levels are so low that they have just evolved into slowing their metabolisms down. And
they have very few young as opposed to 200. They have few, and they live this sort of rarefied existence. It's where time is immaterial, or certainly different than the way we experience it.
Makes me want to slow down a little bit.
Yes.
You know, also Denise Trunk Krigbaum, am I pronouncing that right? And Dinah Leibowitz, Dina talked about signature critters and complexities, and I thought that the snails and the health of springs was an amazing article. Can you touch on that? Just
well, again, I went to the Ichitakni Springs Working Group, and she got up there and gave this article, and Aquiferious had already come out, but I was like, if we do reprinting, can you print the book? And she was excited about that. We both were, but basically, there's a question as to why some springs are cleaner than others. Some have almost no algae, and some have lots of algae, but maybe their recharge area is in a place where it shouldn't be so threatened. Perhaps it's in a forest, or it's not in an agricultural or developed area. So the snails can live more on the newer water with more dissolved oxygen. But the thought is that perhaps we pump more of that water, and it's more the older water that has less dissolved oxygen. And they're in their classes where they can't survive as well. But when they are in the water, you know, that seems to be key with a lot of the very healthy springs, is these little guys just eat tons and tons of algae, tons and tons. Yep. And of course, there are millions and millions of snails. If you go to Silver Glen Springs or Cypress Springs or something, you just see the bank is made of snail shells. So
another guy that I thought was fascinating was Eric Hutchinson, the extreme cave diver, cartographer, artist. His drawings of the underground spring maps were just works of art in themselves.
They're gorgeous, and they're like 6-foot maps, and a lot of them are colored, carefully rendered with Prismacolor, so pencils, and so it's every tree, every piece is there, you know, above piece of tree, above ground, rock, below ground. It's very accurate, but they're also at the same time holy works of art. I mean, they're wonderful spaces that he depicts, and he was fascinating. He's very colorful in his speech and in his work, so it helped me kind of understand the metaphors he used for, he says, diving in a living sculpture. So that's what he thinks the springs are.
Oh, you know, I feel like I need a 6-part mini-series to cover your book, where time is running out here, but throughout this interview, I don't think there's any way to talk adequately about the beauty of your work, so we've been showing it throughout the interview. But I'm curious, and I don't want to let you go before I get an idea of how you do these paintings. Do you set up an easel on the shore and paint, or do you? I think I saw a picture once where you had canvases spread out on a couple of canoes, or on a canoe.
Yeah.
How, is that a difficult question?
No.
Do you do it many ways,
very
or
easy.
How do you?
It has to be pretty simple to do it. The large ones, I don't really need an easel if there's a tree around, because they have heavy wooden frames, stretcher frames, so I can just lean them against something. And if they're very large, I mean, the largest I've worked on at the Springs is 9 foot. If they're very large, they're probably going to tip over most easels we know about. Right. So I also have taken 6-foot canvases on canoes, and smaller ones as well. Then I'll set the box of canvases next to me and maybe float them on the water, because many of the springs are in the middle of the river. And so much of this work is about my reaction to an actual contact with the springs. It's not something, I'll work on them later at home, but it has to be about this astonishment anew, because you can't really conceptualize the springs. You have to keep experiencing them.
Right.
So you make your simple your simple jerry-rig tricks so you can take paintings to the springs.
Also, Margaret, you offer a really unique perspective on the evolution of the springs and what human and just evolutional forces are bringing to the springs. How have the springs changed in your time?
That was the sort of shocking part, because in my work I wanted to do other things about the vicissitudes of time, but I saw the springs, as many of these people, say Bob Knight and his professor Dr. Odom, with Sam, as an unchanging laboratory. And the springs is unchanging, and we guessed that they hadn't changed for, perhaps they had changed structurally, but still basically not for maybe thousands of years. Native Americans had enjoyed them, other populations. And then here I saw them changing so much in 20 years, you know, since I got the throwaway cameras and started recording them.
Right.
You can see some of that in the book. It's like, these things shouldn't be changing so fast. You know, they've gone from blue to green. There's much less flow and discharge. They, the plant life is gone that you once saw, and it's been replaced by algae. They're very threatened. We are just using lots of water. We use more water than anyone else in the world, and we don't even know it half of the time. And we need to use less water and watch what we throw in the ground, because it's really like a sponge absorbing parts of our life, you know, the pollutants. And
well, we're almost out of time, but I'm going to just tell our viewers that one of the reasons I think they should get the book right away is there is a mythological creature named Sirena, and the book goes into great detail about this creature. And I want to tell people that the book is available at Thornbrook Gallery here locally. It's available at Amazon.com. It's available at the Lemieux Galleries in New Orleans. The Harn Museum gift shop. And I'll tell you how I'm going to use this book, in addition to just enjoying it. You've made me just want to get out there. I want to go to every one of these, and you really offer an incredible, it's an incredible guidebook.
Right.
Highly unusual guidebook, but it's just, it makes me want to get out to these things, because I think I've, although I have spent time at springs, I think I have taken them for granted too, and I want to get back to them. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark. And that's exactly what I wanted, is that you can take it and use the maps and go to the springs and write your own Aquaferiousness.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
To find out more about local springs or to get involved, please visit www.santaferiversprings.com.